Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing our sheltering in place satsangs. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dearest friend, Swami Kriyananda, we offer our lives in service and devotion to your cause of self-realization for all. Guide us through the labyrinth of egoic desires, that we may see the light of your pure loving consciousness, and step by step, thought by thought, breath by breath, come closer and closer, more and more perfect, until we merge in thee. Om, peace. Amen. This is going to be rather an extreme place to start, but in my life I have had an interest in people who triumphed over exceedingly difficult circumstances. Keshav, could you raise the camera? It's a little too low.
You mean up?
Yeah, it has to up.
Okay, sure.
Just even a little bit higher. Thank you. Thank you. When the camera lens is a little too low, I have to look down, and I don't like the feeling of looking down. You know, the eyes, conscious and superconscious and subconscious. Thank you. I've always had an interest. I say I used to have an interest because I don't do it anymore. I read lots and lots of books about extreme survival, Holocaust, plane wrecks, mountain climbing, refugees. In fact, it's actually served me extremely well because, true stories, I mean, not novels, because I have all these stories in my mind of the power of the human spirit to triumph over adversity, and also sort of when reduced to its essential essence, how the ingenuity of man takes over and we can find a way. So it's not actually been a morbid interest. It's been, I think, more giving myself examples of courage, so that when faced with difficulties myself, although I've never been faced with such extreme difficulties in this lifetime, there would be something in me that would know we could succeed. One autobiography I read about a man who had been kidnapped in the Far East, in the Near East, the Middle East, by terrorists, and he had 5 years in captivity. And he was a journalist, and he wasn't tortured, he was just confined, and of course it wasn't a very luxurious life. But he said he was constantly writing it as if it was over in his mind. At the end of every day, it's not like he would actually write the pages, but he would summarize the day as if he were back in his home, back in his life, and he was writing the story, which he eventually did. And even that, he knew that there was an element of mental health that was being created because he was constantly reminding himself that this too shall pass. And there will be a time when this isn't happening anymore, which of course is relevant for what we're going through, and maybe even more relevant as we go further into it. But the positive point of what I was wanting to say, I was just giving you a context of why I know this. Virtually every story, I think every story, because this was a necessary element for me to be interested in the stories, there had to be a triumphant element in the consciousness of the author. They would include usually multiple incidents of when, in the midst of whatever it was they were experiencing, they also experienced great joy, sometimes transcendent joy. And sometimes the joy was transcendent because of the contrast. A concentration camp survivor talking about the time they were outside for the roll call and the sunset was just so exquisitely beautiful. Or walking and seeing a single flower growing. When I read the story of the soccer team that crashed in the Andes, and they talked about some of the sunrises, you know, in the snowfields high in the Andes, were just, it took them into you know, heavenly realms of pure bliss, because there was no, everything else had been stripped away. So it was so vivid for them. This is worth remembering. Swami Kriyananda made a very interesting statement in a satsang once. Many of you have heard me repeat it, but it's worth repeating in the moment. He'd given an extraordinary satsang and had just lifted all of us way beyond what my normal consciousness was. I think others in the room felt it as I did. I think Swamiji himself felt it. This was in the early 70s when he was writing The Path, mid-70s, when he was writing The Path, and we used to gather in his house every Thursday in the evening, and he would read chapters of the book. And we was essentially the core group of the community, which was maybe 40 or 50 people, not more than, probably less than that. And he read the chapters, then talked about Master. Then when it was all over, he sort of leaned back and kind of looked out at us, and I always sat very close to him if I could, because my mind is so active. If there were other people between Swamiji and me, I would think about those other people. Whereas if I couldn't see them, it was easier for me to just concentrate on whatever he was offering. But he sort of leaned back with this very blissful look on his face. And he said, when final spiritual liberation comes, you look back at all your incarnations, millions of incarnations. He said, you see that everything was a dream and that none of it really happened. But the only thing that ever really happened is when we actually touched into the true eternal power of spirit. And that we see that all those incarnations were just a series of small incidents, or a series of incidents in which reality actually broke through. And I was thinking, when I was considering all of those individuals who had these transcendent moments in the middle of great suffering, it was like the suffering was the material world, the spiritual world broke through, and they were able to tell that something completely different had happened. Now, I'm going to actually go to where I really was going to go today. I got kind of drawn into that thought. Last summer, August and September, I was in India, and we went out to the land outside of Pune, which Ananda India had purchased in the hope of making a community. So far, the community hasn't come together, but the land is still there, and there's a small number of people who live there, and they run retreats and various things. One direction didn't quite fulfill itself, but other directions it may be possible. On that property is a house that Swami built and lived in for a few years there. And in one of the products that he made in India were these printed color posters with various proverbs, his own sayings, but aphorisms, wise, interesting sayings. It's a beautiful set of products. When I went into his office, the office of his house in Pune, one of those posters was on the wall, and it had a quote on it that I never remember seeing the poster, although I was often in that room, and I never remember the quote. And it was this: joy will be yours when you can hold the griefs of others up to God's love for His comfort. Now, somehow at the time, those words spoke deeply to my heart, and I knew that there was something in it for me, but I didn't really quite understand it. And I wrote it on this little tiny piece of paper, and I've literally kept it in front of me on my desk, on the base of my computer, for months. And I would read it periodically and never quite understand what it meant. And then recently I shared it with my friend Devarshi, who's a Nayaswami who lives in India. And he actually explained it to me. So I wanted to and he says it this way: from the perspective of why does Divine Mother need us to bring other suffering to her attention? Of course she doesn't need it, Devarshi writes to me, but we do. So he says, I use the analogy of a child seeing their brother or sister suffering or in grief, and what would you do if you couldn't fix it? We would go and call our mother and ask her to please console the brother and sister because they are hurting and they are in pain. And there's he refers to the chant when we say, they have heard of thy name, the halt, blind and the lame. Do not turn them away, Mother. Wipe their tears, give them an audience, comfort them, Mother. And it's we who are asking Divine Mother to help those who are suffering, because it's beyond us to do it. Now, the reason I knew this was important for me, but you see, you have to have the compassion to want to do it. You have to have the humility and self-acceptance to realize one's own limitations. You have to have the faith in God that your prayers will be heard. You have to have the belief that Divine Mother knows what is best for her children. And all of that brings great joy to the heart of the self who is solving others' problems by just laying them at the feet of Divine Mother. I hope that makes sense to you. It makes a great deal of sense to me, and it helps. Not that I'm there. I mean, I just really actually thought about this yesterday or the day before when Devarshi wrote me that email that I was just writing to you from. Because one of the most frightening aspects of the situation that we're in now and the potential it has to cause more grief for more people is really not what might happen to me, but what I might have to witness. And how am I going to have the strength to witness that? Mother Teresa of Calcutta basically has magnetized the whole world, both to her form of Christianity, and in India she became the face of Christianity, and in many ways elevated all of India's appreciation of what devotion to Jesus could be. And throughout the world, she has captured the world's imagination of the potential of the love for God. Not everyone understands it as Mother Teresa herself did, but nonetheless, the example is there, and it causes all of us who are sensitive to measure ourselves against it. And in a documentary I've seen about her, which has many fine elements, one of the parts of it follows her out onto the streets of Calcutta, where she goes into the most deprived areas, and she finds people who are literally dying on the street, and she comforts them, and she moves them into her hospice homes if she can. And so you see her, she's kneeling on this street, which in itself is not very clean, and there's this emaciated person whose physical form, is just degraded, and it would be the kind of thing you could barely look at. And not only is she looking at it, but she's lifting him and she's taking care of him like this and she's moving him. And I think one of the cameramen or somebody with her basically says, "How are you able to do this?" And her response is, "Because I'm not serving this man. In him I see the presence of Jesus." And Jesus, of course, is beautiful and magnetic to her. So she can, when she sees this form, which to all of us is, to the ordinary person is hardly bearable, what she sees shining through it is the presence of Jesus. And it's Jesus himself that she picks up and carries. In the Bible, Jesus says, whenever what you do to the least of them, you do to me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was lonely and you comforted me. I was in prison and you visited me. And the disciples say, "Lord, we don't remember doing any of those things for you. When were you in prison? When were you hungry?" And he says, "That which you have done to the least, you have done to me." So there's that side of it also in terms of other people's suffering, which is, it is the presence of God within them that we are always relating to. Now, Swamiji had a very interesting and also exceedingly helpful statement for how to deal with the sufferings of others. And he put it this way. He said, when I see people in a state of grief or a state of ignorance that is going to lead them into greater suffering, and I recognize, what they're going to have to experience, he said, what it makes me think about the day when all of that suffering ends and they're able to realize God, how much more joyful will be that experience of God because of the contrast with the suffering. Now, the reason Swamiji could think like that has to do with what I talked about a few sessions ago when I was talking about time. And I was talking, the more that we are identified with the outer wheel of the circle of time and locked into what is perceivable by the senses and what is rememberable by this one brain, the more difficult it is to understand the longer flow of karma, of life, of where happiness comes from. But when we move toward the center of superconsciousness, we're able to see things from a broader perspective. This is a wheel with many spokes, and the hub of the wheel is from which everything emanates is superconsciousness, and they go out to the spokes of the wheel, and each of us, our incarnations, are one of these dots on the spokes of the wheel. And from the farthest point of the wheel, all you can see is a little bit forward and backwards. But as you move in on the spoke and are closer to superconsciousness, your view of past and present, which is what the wheel represents, becomes much more expanded. So Swamiji could sit from the center of superconsciousness and he would realize that the God realization of every soul moving across through this wheel was as close as the worst suffering they had ever experienced. And in keeping with that statement that he made, none of this suffering actually exists except in the illusion of cause and effect that we live in. Now, those words to me are just words, because the illusion of cause and effect is not an illusion to me. I know it as an idea, but not as an experience. And so that's why the suffering of others is so intense, because there they are. In physical, mental, emotional pain, we're just watching it. But inherent in that emotional pain is the fact that through that suffering, delusion will be overcome, and therefore it's cause for rejoicing. A very complicated thought, but not really, because it can just be turned into that feeling in one's own heart, and that looking at every soul and realizing The same divine potential exists in everyone. Just as simple as that. There was one of the stories at the beginning of this, which some of you didn't hear. I talked about how for many years of my life, I read many stories of people in extreme circumstances. And I believe it helped me overcome a lot of fears to do that. And one story I read was about a man who was a prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. And the conditions that some of the American soldiers were held in were pretty tough. And there was a man who wrote about being tortured. And he was pushed so far beyond what he was able to deal with in his own ego. And he was a Christian, that he surrendered his life to Jesus in a way that he'd never been able to do before. And when he was brought to the place where he'd always been subjected to torture by this one man who somehow felt that that was his duty to do that to him, the man said there was nothing in him that could resist anymore. He just rested in the presence of Jesus. And he said his torturer just looked at him, sent him back to his prison cell, and he was never tortured again. It was like that was all that was needed. And also, in that, what he was also practicing, he didn't have these words, but he was practicing pure ahimsa, which is there was no longer any reality to what he was doing. The only reality he was experiencing was resting in the presence of Jesus. And every other part of it was incidental to that. That's the story of the concentration camp survivors seeing the sunset. It was just so transcendent in its beauty that everything else was forgotten. And when those moments come, which they often come to all of us, whether our circumstances are that extreme or not, we realize that all suffering is forgotten in that moment. And all that we're conscious of is the upliftment of joy. In these several weeks of confinement that we've been through, I, like everyone, have had better and worse days and better and worse moments. But there have been enough moments of this feeling of this peculiar paradoxical feeling of great freedom. And in that great freedom, everything else is forgotten. So what we're having, you see, in those moments is we're having a little mini experience of what actual divine freedom would be like. That's what Swami's trying to say to us. When Swami was a young disciple with Master, Swami was trying to purify himself in every way he could. And he said to Master, help me to overcome my attachment to good food. Swami was, he had a refined palate. I will put it like that. He was not a glutton, even by any stretch of the imagination, but he had a refined palate, and he liked food that was well cooked. And for many years at the end of his life, Leela, who was his cook, was one of the most refined cooks ever. She cooked perfectly and beautifully for him, and he enjoyed that even at the end of his life. So he said to Master, help me to overcome my attachment to good food. And Master just sort of waved his hands and he said, when ecstasy comes, everything goes. Now, in that sense, Swami was talking about something that was a pleasure for him but was an attachment. But when ecstasy comes, everything goes. And this is why every saint who reaches that threshold of freedom, as Swami puts it, they never complain. They never say, oh, this really wasn't worth it. I've been cheated. Why did it happen this way? Because in that perception of freedom, you realize that it was never different. This is the word realization. That's why self-realization is such an important phrase. It's not an achievement. It's just an awakening from non-understanding to understanding. When you realize something, it hasn't suddenly dawned. It hasn't come into existence in that moment. What's come into existence is our understanding of it. So coming back to where I started in the middle with this quote from Master, from Swamiji, when we are able to see even that others are suffering, feel their suffering, and then just put it at the feet of Divine Mother with the same confidence that, as my friend Devarshi said, that if my sibling were suffering and I told my mother what was wrong, I know my mother would fix it. And then, of course, I have to have the faith that whatever I see her doing is her way of fixing it. You know, these are big teachings, and I myself this morning am a little tender in terms of my my absoluteness. But sometimes that's exactly what we need. You know, sometimes we're very strong, and sometimes our strength is that we're very weak, and we're simply looking out at what God is doing with us and praying with all our hearts that we can rise to the challenge. And even the fact that we turn to God for strength is a confirmation of the fact that our feet are firmly on the path and that God will not forget us. God bless you.